Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt Westbourne never imagined that in the midst of the chaos and danger lurking inside the walls of the Five Poppies Resort, she would come face to face with a truth her heart was never prepared to confront. For so long, she had accepted Jason Morgan's death as a permanent scar, a wound that had closed only on the surface while bleeding silently beneath. Yet there he stood before her, alive, solid, a living reminder of everything she thought she had lost forever. The sight of him shook her to her core, her chest tightening with a wave of emotions that crashed so violently it nearly stole her breath away. At first, her heart trembled with relief, with the kind of gratitude that comes only when one has been given a miracle. But that fragile joy was swiftly replaced with fury, because Jason's return was not about her, and his presence here was never meant for her sake. The reality cut deep. Once again, every choice Jason had made, every sacrifice he had endured, every move that defined his existence, all circled back to Carly Spencer. Carly's name, Carly's shadow, Carly's unshakable hold, always standing between them like an impenetrable wall. It enraged Britt, humiliating her in ways that words could never capture. She had mourned Jason, she had cried at his grave, and she had tried to make peace with the loss. Now, standing in front of her, he wasn't the man she could claim, but the man Carly would always command. The betrayal burned, her veins searing with indignation, and in a moment of raw defiance, Britt demanded that Jason leave. She expelled him from her world with a finality that carried both heartbreak and fury, as if in that act she severed every remaining thread that had once bound them together. The silence that followed Jason's departure was suffocating. Britt stood alone in her room, her body taut with both tension and resolve. The man she had once allowed herself to love was gone, and with his absence came clarity. She no longer wanted to be a victim caught in the labyrinth of power games that men like Jason and women like Carly perpetually ruled. She no longer wanted to be haunted by the impossible dream of a love that would never be hers. If she was to survive, if she was to reclaim her identity, it had to be through her own will and her own vengeance. And so, she reached for the phone, her hands trembling not with fear but with cold determination. The WSB's presence in Dalmatia was no longer rumor but a certainty, and Britt knew that she could wield this knowledge like a blade. She made contact with those who operated in the shadows, aligning herself with forces ready to shift the balance of power. Her voice was steady as she gave the warning, knowing full well that her words carried the weight of life and death. In that single choice, she lit the fuse of a chain reaction, one that would pull innocent and guilty alike into its blast. Without hesitation, she set events in motion that placed Jocelyn, Jax and Vaughn directly in the crosshairs of an inevitable storm. For Jocelyn and Vaughn, the mission had begun as something simple, a reconnaissance assignment meant to observe and report. But the luxury and glamour of the Five Poppies had proved to be nothing more than a facade masking lethal danger. Their covers had been shredded to pieces the moment they set foot inside, thanks to Colette Moreau's treachery. Colette, the supposed ally, had already betrayed them, exposing their identities to Pascal. Now, instead of operatives on a mission, Joss and Vaughn were prey, hunted with ruthless efficiency through the halls of the resort. The danger escalated quickly. Vaughn's life nearly ended in the crushing grip of an assassin's hands, the world going dark around him as oxygen was torn away. It was only Jocelyn's instinctive, desperate reaction, a gunshot fired in terror, that forced the attacker to falter. But even that was not enough. Vaughn, regaining his breath, had been forced to deliver the fatal blow himself, ensuring their survival at the cost of his own humanity. Blood stained their hands, their clothes, and their conscience, and while their bodies lived on, their spirits staggered under the weight of what they had done. Jocelyn, trembling, could not escape the horror of it all. This was not the life she had chosen, not the path she envisioned, yet here she was again with blood smeared across her memory. She had killed before, but this time felt different. This time it was as though death itself had marked her as its reluctant accomplice. Vaughn, hardened by necessity, tried to shoulder the burden, but even he was not immune to the shadows of guilt. The two of them, once merely undercover agents, now became fugitives of fate, their every step forward stalked by unseen eyes and the inevitability of violence. And still, worse waited ahead. For what neither Jocelyn nor Vaughn knew was that Britt, the woman Joss once considered a strange but reluctant ally, had sharpened her resentment into a blade aimed squarely at them. Jocelyn was not simply another agent in Britt's eyes, she was Carly's daughter. Every ounce of anguish, every betrayal Britt attributed to Carly had now been projected onto Joss. In Britt's twisted logic, punishing Jocelyn was the only way to punish Carly, the only way to balance the scales for a love she felt had been stolen from her. Thus, the resort became a battlefield woven not just with espionage but with the tangled threads of personal vendetta. As Pascal tightened his grip and the walls of 5 Poppies closed in, Jocelyn and Vaughn found themselves ensnared in a web of betrayal that reached far beyond their mission. They were no longer simply fighting to survive, they were symbols in a war they hadn't chosen, pawns in Britt's desperate attempt to reclaim dignity from the ashes of heartbreak. The nightmare of blood and fire had only begun, and though Jason's shadow lingered on the edges of their fight, the true threat came from the woman who had once saved Jocelyn's life. Now, that same woman had become her executioner in spirit, determined to make Carly's daughter suffer in ways she herself had once suffered. With Britt, nothing truly ended with Jason. His presence at the 5 Poppies had reopened wounds she thought were scarred over, but the deeper truth was that her heart had been bleeding for years, and Carly Spencer was the reason why. Every loss Britt had endured, every shred of love she had been denied, every glimmer of hope extinguished in her life, she traced it all back to Carly. Jason had chosen Carly in ways that Britt could never erase, even in death, and when Jason returned alive yet still tethered to that same name, the fury in Britt hardened into something irreversible. Jocelyn Jacks, Carly's daughter, became the perfect embodiment of that bitterness. She was no longer just a WSB operative caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, she was the living reminder of Britt's rival, the child of the woman whose shadow loomed like a curse over her life. The plan crystallized inside Britt's mind with terrifying precision. Jocelyn would suffer, not only as an agent targeted by mercenaries but as the symbol of Carly herself. Vaughn, loyal and protective, was collateral damage, an added casualty to intensify the pain. In Britt's mind, the symmetry was poetic. Carly had cost her love, so Carly's daughter would pay the price in blood and fear. With that conviction, Britt moved silently, weaving her strings in the dark. She gave orders through encrypted channels, summoning allies from the underworld who thrived in shadows, ensuring their focus was clear. Jocelyn and Vaughn were no longer just enemies, they were the centerpiece of her vengeance. The cruel irony lay in Jocelyn's perception. To Joss, Britt had once been something more than an adversary. She had been the woman who saved her life when everything seemed lost, the doctor whose unexpected compassion had pulled her back from the brink. That sliver of history created a thread of trust, fragile but genuine, one Joss clung to as she stumbled deeper into danger. What she could not fathom was that very same woman had turned her into prey, surrounding her with traps so insidious that every hallway, every corner of the 5 Poppies might conceal death. Britt had stopped distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. Her hatred was so consuming that it no longer cared for nuance, everyone who reminded her of Carly's power had become the enemy. Within the marble walls and candlelit corridors of the 5 Poppies, the atmosphere shifted. Once opulent and intoxicating, the resort became a labyrinth of menace. Jocelyn and Vaughn could sense it in the silence between footsteps, in the way the chandeliers seemed to flicker at the wrong moment, in the echo of whispers that weren't their own. Every step felt like trespassing into a graveyard, every door a possible ambush. Their nerves stretched thinner by the hour, and the fear that any moment could be their last hung heavy in the air. Pascal, ruthless and impatient, was the hand guiding the hunt. His men stalked the grounds with silent efficiency, cutting off escape routes, tightening the perimeter like a noose. He thrived on control, savoring the chase, yet even he did not realize that he too was a piece in Britt's larger game. She allowed him to believe he was orchestrating the kill, but in truth, she was waiting for Jocelyn's inevitable fall, her vengeance painted across the floor in blood. And Britt herself? She watched from the shadows of her room, calm, collected, lips curled into a smile that was colder than steel. Her eyes held no hesitation, only anticipation, as though she were an audience of one to the theater of her revenge. To her, this was not merely an execution of WSB agents. It was art, a carefully staged reckoning meant to deliver her the justice she believed had been stolen. Jocelyn's suffering would not simply end with death. It would carry the weight of Britt's years of betrayal, heartbreak, and unrelenting loneliness. Vaughn's demise would serve as the final touch, collateral fire ensuring that Carly's daughter would be stripped of both victory and hope. For Jocelyn and Vaughn, there was no way to comprehend how deeply personal the trap around them had become. They thought they were fighting Pascal, evading mercenaries, and clinging to survival against enemies who saw them only as targets. But in truth, they were caught in a vendetta far larger than their mission, dragged into the center of Britt's broken heart and twisted logic. Each breath they took, each corridor they dared to enter, brought them closer to a fate Britt had already written. And in the stillness of the 5 poppies, where luxury met death, only one certainty remained: Britt Westbourne's revenge was not about espionage, politics, or survival. It was about unleashing her fury upon Carly's legacy, and Jocelyn was the vessel through which that fury would finally erupt. Jason walked away from Britt's room, but every step felt like a betrayal of instinct. He had been ordered out, cast aside in the same way she had cast aside hope, but his mind refused to accept it. He knew Britt too well, he had seen the way grief hollowed her, the way anger filled that emptiness like poison. He had once thought she was strong enough to fight it, to resist letting pain turn her into something dangerous. Now he feared he had underestimated the darkness in her. Britt's heartbreak had always been tied to him, to Carly, to the shadow of choices he could never undo. And when he thought of Jocelyn and Vaughn, 2 young operatives now stranded in the deadly web that Britt had spun tighter with every passing hour, the guilt pressed down like iron on his chest. Jason had lived a life defined by choices, each one costing someone something. He had lost brothers, friends, lovers, all to the violence that followed him like a shadow. And here it was again, circling him at the 5 poppies, demanding another choice. Did he return to Britt, try to salvage the broken fragments of the woman he once cared for, or did he put everything aside to protect Jocelyn, Carly's daughter, from being punished for a feud she had never asked to be part of? The weight of his connection to Carly suffocated him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many sacrifices he made, her presence was always at the heart of every storm. While Jason wrestled with himself, Jocelyn was beginning to see through the cracks of her situation. At first, she thought the resort was merely a gilded cage run by Pascal, a man whose cruelty was evident in every order he gave and every mercenary who obeyed him. But as she pieced together Britt's behavior, the hollow way her eyes lingered, the clipped tone in her voice, the calculated coldness in her movements, Jocelyn realized the danger wasn't just from the outside. It was standing beside her. The realization made her heart pound harder than any assassin's footsteps ever could. Britt had once been the unexpected savior, the woman whose sharp tongue hit a heart that, in rare moments, showed compassion. Jocelyn remembered the gratitude she had felt, the strange sense of safety Britt had given her once, as if their fates had crossed for a reason. But now that thread of trust unraveled completely. Every memory of kindness soured, transformed into a prelude to betrayal. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her, that Britt wasn't protecting her anymore. Britt was hunting her. Vaughn saw the shift in Jocelyn before she spoke it aloud. He watched the color drain from her face, the way her body stiffened when Britt's name was mentioned. He tried to reassure her, to keep her focused on survival, but he could not erase the pain in her eyes. Jocelyn wasn't just afraid for her life, she was mourning the loss of something intangible, the cruel destruction of hope. Betrayal by an enemy was expected. Betrayal by someone who once saved you left scars deeper than any knife. Meanwhile, Britt sat in her room like a queen in exile, orchestrating the downfall of her enemies with precision. She had given the order, and her allies in the shadows obeyed without question. They were to corner Jocelyn and Vaughn, to strip them of every chance at escape, to make their deaths both inevitable and symbolic. In her mind, she replayed the years of anguish, the nights of loneliness, the moments where Jason's devotion was always reserved for Carly. It had broken her, piece by piece, until all that remained was the need to make someone else feel that same ruin. Jocelyn's face became Carly's in her imagination, every frightened look, every desperate breath feeding Britt's hunger for justice twisted into cruelty. The 5 poppies transformed under her design. What had once been corridors of marble and glass now felt like a maze of traps. Pascal's men followed her instructions, whether they knew it or not, and the walls seemed to close in tighter around Jocelyn and Vaughn with every passing hour. Cameras tracked their movements, doors locked with silent precision, hallways emptied moments before they entered. Even the flicker of light above their heads was calculated to unsettle them. Britt had turned the resort into a stage, and Jocelyn into the tragic heroine destined to fall. But Jason could not walk away. He felt it in his bones, the sense that if he left now, he would be complicit in the destruction of not only Jocelyn and Vaughn, but Britt herself. He paced the grounds, scanning the shadows, torn between duty and emotion. He remembered the moment Britt had told him she forgave him at his grave, the soft trembling of her voice, the way her grief had seemed to finally release her. Now she had taken that forgiveness back, weaponized it, and turned it into fire aimed at the wrong target. Jason could not allow her to cross the line she stood on. He knew once she did, there would be no bringing her back. Inside, Jocelyn reached her breaking point. She whispered to Vaughn that Britt was no longer with them, that every instinct screamed she had become the enemy. Vaughn wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but as the night wore on, he too saw it, the deliberate absence of protection, the way Britt seemed to vanish just as danger grew near. He realized then that they were not just being hunted by Pascal. They were being offered up, sacrificed in a personal war that had nothing to do with the mission. And with that came the cruelest truth. Jocelyn was not fighting to prove herself as an agent of WSB, nor simply to survive Pascal's hunt. She was fighting to prove that she was more than Carly's daughter, that her identity was not a weapon to be used against her. She fought to exist beyond the shadow of her mother, beyond the legacy of betrayal and pain that had defined the lives of everyone who crossed Carly's path. But here she was again, forced to bleed because of a war she never started. The storm at the 5 poppies grew heavier, each moment taut with tension. Jason drew closer, determined to intercept before Britt's vengeance turned fatal. Britt tightened her grip, convinced that watching Jocelyn fall would finally heal the wound Carly left behind. And Jocelyn, trembling yet unbroken, prepared herself not only for the fight of her life but for the emotional reckoning of facing the woman who once saved her, only to become her executioner. It was no longer just a mission, no longer just survival. It was a battle between past and present, between love and hatred, between redemption and vengeance. And as the walls closed in, every soul inside the resort knew one truth: by dawn, blood would decide whose legacy endured. At the 5 poppies, the night stretched on like a slow descent into purgatory. Every corridor echoed with footsteps that could belong to friend or foe, every flicker of shadow seemed to conceal the glint of steel or the glimmer of betrayal. In those suffocating hours, choices defined everything, choices carved out of desperation, anger, and the haunting weight of memory. Britt chose hatred. Jason chose protection, though always too late to stop the damage. Jocelyn and Vaughn chose survival, but each step they took was over a ground soaked in blood and trust already shattered. And looming over them all, even in her absence, was Carly. Her name, her legacy, her unrelenting shadow haunted the resort, twisting every action until it became about her, whether the characters admitted it or not. She was the ghost in every decision, the echo in every betrayal. For Britt, the decision to embrace vengeance was both inevitable and damning. She had lived too long in the shadow of Carly's dominance over Jason's life, too long believing she could be something more, someone more to him. Now, with Jason alive yet still tethered to Carly's existence, Britt abandoned the last shred of forgiveness she carried. Hatred was easier. It was pure, consuming, and it gave her a purpose she could control. She convinced herself that punishing Jocelyn was justice, that by tearing apart Carly's daughter, she could finally reclaim her dignity from years of humiliation and loneliness. But as she descended further, hatred ceased to be her weapon, it became her prison, chaining her heart more tightly than the love she once sought to bury. Jason's choices weighed heavier with every second. His instincts screamed to protect, to step between death and those too young to bear its finality. But his past had already tangled the threads too tightly. He was haunted by the knowledge that he was always a step behind, always arriving after the damage had been done. Too many times he had failed those who trusted him, and now Jocelyn and Vaughn were caught in the same cycle. He wanted to save Britt, to pull her back from the abyss she had chosen, but he could not deny that Jocelyn, Carly's daughter, was at the center of it all.